Have you ever tried to start something creative just to realize that you've been staring at a blank page for hours? I know that I have. Instead of writing, I am thinking about writing. Instead of filming something, I am thinking about what I should be filming. It's crazy if you think about it. I have all the time in the world. I have an unlimited amount of things that I could be writing about or that I could be filming, but I just don't. And that abundance of freedom and time might just be the problem. I'm going to tell you what the latest research in creativity tells us about this. The problem of a blank page is quite universal. I think everyone has been through that at some point or another. It's even one of the most used cliches in films and movies. But it's a cliche that works. Everyone can relate. From writing to filming to painting to science and product development. In all fields, this is a real issue. It can be really hard to get started when you don't know what you should be focusing on. And there are many names for this. Creative block, creative resistance, even burnout. And a gut reaction to feeling this type of creative block could be to try and think outside of the box, to open up the solution space and make sure that we have more solutions that we can draw from. But that is actually all wrong. And according to this study made by European creativity researchers, what we actually need is a better box with more definitions and the clearer rules to state what we can be working on, and that's how we unlock our creativity. A few years back I was facilitating this workshop and it was for an insurance company, and we wanted to see how we can use new technology to make better service offerings for customers. So we wanted them to be creative and solve problems and make sure that they can come up with the best solutions that they can. But we were really struggling. I was struggling, the group was struggling, we were getting nowhere. I had asked them to come up with some great ideas, and unfortunately that didn't work. They were feeling annoyed. One guy in the group was actually almost quite hostile towards me. At a break in the session, I went up to the guy and I asked him, what's the problem? What can I help you with something? And he just told me that he didn't want to be there. He'd been in a similar workshop a couple of weeks before and nothing had come out of it. They'd come up with nothing and they had nothing that they could use to improve their offering. I asked him to be patient, join us for one more session and we'll see what comes out of it, and if you don't like it you can leave. And he agreed to that, and when we got back I thought I should be trying something new. So I told them to draw from their own experience. Tell me about an experience that you've had with an insurance company and tell me specifically if you found something that wasn't great, a problem that you would like to solve. And by limiting our solution space to the problems that they had found, we actually were able to start generating some really cool ideas on how to use the technology to solve those specific problems. What we had done is to create output constraints, and that really helped the group's creativity. But why did this limitation change anything? Well, they no longer had the freedom to solve any problem that they like on the workshop. They couldn't just look at technologies and try to figure out good solutions to problems. They had to be limited to solving the problems that we had identified as important. That meant that they could actually focus their energy and come up with solutions that weren't so obvious. And what did the man think? Well, he actually came up to me afterwards and told me that he'd really enjoyed it and he was glad that he stuck with it. Output constraints are interesting. It's the constraints that we put on the result of a creative process. If you're a painter, it could be constraining yourself to only painting in one style. It's a requirement specification. It's a brief of some sort. Sometimes that can be annoying, it can be restricting, it can be hard, but I think we should try to look at it as constraints that we can work around. We can be creative inside the boundaries of that brief. And most of the time, I think that elevates the result. But output constraints aren't the only type of constraints. There are also input constraints. That's more to do with what you can bring into the creative process. So if there's a lack of money or time, or you don't have enough people to work with, you can also use these constraints to make sure that you get work done really quickly. Because what input constraints does is that they tend to focus the work, they tend to make sure that you stay within the scope of those input constraints. And that can be really useful. If you have a deadline, you're gonna sort of fill that time up until the deadline with work. So if you have an indefinite deadline, you might never get there. But if you have a 2-day deadline, you're gonna make sure that you can finish your work up until then. Another type of input constraint could be a painter deciding that, okay, so I'm only gonna use these 3 colors when painting this painting. And that will change the output as well, but it's a limitation on what you bring into the process. The last type of constraint is the process constraint. So that's when you decide that, okay, but when we do this creative thing, we're gonna do it in a certain way. And this could be painting with a specific technique, or making sure that we communicate with our teammate members in a specific way or in a specific cadence. What is clear, both from the research and my experience, is that a creative process where you have no constraints is almost always going to result in it takes time for you to start because you don't know where. You're going to go for very obvious solutions. You're going to take the path of least resistance. And if you have no resistance, the result is going to be quite banal. I think it's a really good idea to think about, okay, can I introduce constraints and make sure that the end result of this is more interesting than if I hadn't? And we can do this in our own creative work. We can set deadlines. We can budget for only spending a certain amount of money or resources on something. We can make sure that we have a process that we always need to paint between 8 and 10 in the day, and that will make sure that we actually get more stuff done. We can also set constraints on the output. We can make sure that we decide that, okay, when I'm done with this, it's gonna have this, this, and this characteristic. Like I did with this video, I decided that I wanted to try 2 things to constrain myself when writing the script. The first thing that I wanted was for the script to be written in 1 evening. So I put an input constraint on myself to make sure that I didn't spend too much time, that I didn't try to perfect it, but that I got started and I got going and I got it done. The second constraint that I put on this script was that I wanted to make sure that the output contained a personal story of something that I have been through myself, and that I circle back to that story once in a while in this script so that you have something that you can follow along. That's why I introduced the story of the group that I facilitated a workshop for and how they thrived when they got a couple of constraints put on their creativity. The reason why putting constraints on creativity works so well is that when we put friction on our problems, we get a lot of leverage from that. But can there be too much of a good thing? Well, yes. You can't just keep adding constraints and hope that your creative process will become better. It doesn't work like that. What happens is if you have no constraints, you're going to benefit a lot from introducing some limitations to your work. So that's going to continue for a while. You can introduce more and more constraints and you're going to get a better and better creative process. At some point, you're going to be at the peak. When you're at the peak of what benefits you can get from introducing more constraints, you're going to start to see that it gets frustrating. It gets hard to come up with any solutions. And by making the constraints harsher, your process is just going to devolve more. So it's important that we be a little bit careful with how harsh we make these constraints. But did I succeed in creating a script according to my limitations? Well, I did complete the script in 1 evening, and that was nice. I really pushed myself and I really got it done. I really worked on it. I did introduce the story of my workshop into the script, and I think that it adds something, but it's not really up to me to evaluate it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna send it to my friend that I made in that workshop a couple of years ago now, see what he thinks about it. I'm glad that he's not mad at me and that he usually gives me really good input on my work. And input on my work is what is gonna make it better for the next time. If you have any, write to me in the comments. If you're curious to see something else, check out this video. I hope you have a great day. Bye.